If the gold price were to fall, let's say next February, the price of gold was to fall from 4,000 to 3,000. A lot of people who today characterize themselves as gold bugs would wish they never learned to spell gold. But that price decline will not, in any way, shape, or form, change the arithmetic around the US dollar or the probability of a soft default. Gold, I would suggest, if it fell by 25%, which would scare people out, would be a substantially better buy after than before, because the outcome's the same, irrespective of the near-term price move. Since the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913, according to the St. Louis Fed, the US dollar has lost 97% of its purchasing power. So to say that that phenomenon is something new ignores a lot of history. It's my belief that the next 10 years will see us destroy 75% of the 3% that's left. Let me tell you a little bit about why. The on-balance sheet liabilities that you described, 37 trillion, are ugly enough. Note that that number needs to be reduced perhaps by 7 trillion, which is the Fed's own balance sheet. In other words, they have a lot of paper on their own balance sheet, but 31 is pretty bad. The truly ugly number, Darcy, is the net present value of unfunded entitlement liabilities. Debts that are off balance sheet, but promises that have been made to old codgers like me, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, military pensions, federal pensions. That number, the net present value, not nominal number, that number, according to the Congressional Budget Office, is $120 trillion. So you add 31 trillion, let's round it down to 30. And you add that to 120 trillion, the number, the headline debt of the US government, not including state and local governments, is $150 trillion. Now let's put that in perspective. The Internal Revenue Service suggests that the aggregate net worth of all American citizens combined is 167 trillion. So we're worth 167 trillion and we owe 150 trillion. And that 150 trillion gets worse by $2 trillion a year on balance sheet and $2 trillion a year off balance sheet. And that number needs to be put in the context of the fact that the gross revenues of the US government, before they spend a dime, are $5 trillion. So we take in 5 trillion and we increase the debt by 4 trillion and we owe 150 trillion. So let your listeners ask themselves, what do they think the alternatives are?
The U.S. national debt, often referenced around $30+ trillion, only reveals part of the story. Far more concerning are the promises made outside the official balance sheet. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, federal pensions, military retirements, and other entitlements. The Congressional Budget Office estimates these unfunded liabilities exceed $120 trillion in present value terms. Combined, America's total obligations approach $150 trillion, nearly matching the estimated net worth of all U.S. households. With deficits growing by trillions annually and federal revenue hovering around $5 trillion per year, the math becomes impossible to ignore. These structural commitments shape everything ahead, from policy responses to investor behavior.
I think it's important for people to realize that gold's already up 12-fold since the year 2000. So I'm not, and also realize that in the 1970s, part of that move was due to the fact that gold had been price controlled. What I'm suggesting is that the nominal price of gold, the US dollar price of gold, probably mirrors the decline in the purchasing power of the US dollar. Will gold increase threefold or fourfold? I don't know. My crystal ball is cracked and cloudy. It only makes arithmetic sense that gold priced in dollars will increase in a fashion that mirrors the decrease in the absolute purchasing power of the US dollar. By the way, I don't think that the US dollar needs do poorly against other fiat currencies. My friend Doug Casey once said the US dollar is the worst currency in the world, with the sole exception of all of the others. So I'm not
Yeah.
suggesting to you that the US dollar does poorly compared to the Canadian dollar, the New Zealand dollar, the euro, the pound. I'm just saying in an absolute sense that there's going to be a reckoning.
And what does that mean then for the rest of the world if they're the dirtier shirts in the laundry?
Not necessarily dirtier shirts, but I've heard people say, well, Rick, would you then advocate buying Australian dollars or Canadian dollars? No, I wouldn't. I would advocate buying investments in companies that traditionally have pricing power and owning baskets of goods that do well during times of inflation. I don't think that you can sit out a sovereign crisis in a sovereign. So I'm not recommending, as an example,
Right.
long British bonds, long Euro bonds, or for that matter, long Kiwi bonds.
Gold's rise isn't simply a speculative trend, it reflects a long term response to declining currency strength. Since 2000, gold has climbed more than 12-fold, tracking the weakening dollar. While no one can predict whether it triples or quadruples from here, the logic remains consistent. As the dollar loses value, gold tends to reprice accordingly. This doesn't require the dollar to collapse relative to other fiat currencies, just to continue eroding in absolute purchasing power. History shows that gold thrives under chronic inflation, sovereign stress, and monetary uncertainty. Investors must expect volatility, but also recognize the underlying math driving long-term demand.
I'm not smart enough to time the volatility, but I have a very good memory. In the decade of the 70s, and by the way, I was around and in the game then, that decade was spectacular for gold. It went from $35 to $850. Many people don't remember that in the middle of that bull market in 1975, we had a what I would call cyclical decline in a secular bull market in 1975, where the gold price fell by half and the prices of gold equities were even more dramatically impacted. People who got shaken out missed an eightfold increase in the gold price over 5 years. So it's important that if people are moved by the arithmetic behind my thesis, that they understand that they will have to endure both volatility and cyclicality. There will absolutely be a time in the next 10 years where the gold price falls momentarily by 20 or 30 or 40%. That will occur. It's important to understand the arithmetic as opposed to the narrative so that you have the psychological and financial ability to stay the trade as opposed to being shaken out the way hundreds of thousands of people did in 1975. If the gold price were to fall, let's say next February, the price of gold was to fall from 4,000 to 3,000. A lot of people who today characterize themselves as gold bugs would wish they never learned to spell gold. But that price decline will not, in any way, shape, or form, change the arithmetic around the US dollar or the probability of a soft default. Gold, I would suggest, if it fell by 25%, which would scare people out, would be a substantially better buy after than before, because the outcome's the same, irrespective of the near-term price movement.
To understand today's inflation cycle, one only needs to revisit the 1970s. Gold surged from $35 to over $800, but not without painful corrections. In 1975, halfway through the bull run, gold dropped nearly 50%, shaking out countless investors who later missed an eightfold rebound. Similar patterns are likely today. Temporary declines of 20 to 40% can strike even during powerful secular uptrends. Those anchored in arithmetic rather than emotion historically come out ahead. As financial conditions tighten and real inflation exceeds official measures, gold becomes not just a hedge, but a long-term strategic asset for navigating monetary instability.
About magically, we did it the last time because we elected a guy who promised to cut the size of government. He didn't actually accomplish that. Mr. Reagan, however, did slow the rate of growth.
Yeah.
At the same time, he allowed Paul Volcker the latitude to allow the interest rate to rise. By the way, Paul Volcker didn't raise the interest rate. He merely allowed market forces to take the interest rate up at a rate faster than inflation, which broke the back of inflation. Breaking the back of inflation and the subsequent ability over the next 10 years to lower the real interest rate meant that the US economy went on a real tear. And the economy grew much faster than debt and deficits, ushering in, I would suggest, a golden age from 1982 to 2022. We need to work our way through all that again. We need to reduce the net present value of our obligations. We do that by devaluing the dollar at the same time that we don't index revenues, which is to say taxation for inflation. In other words, we steal more from our citizenry while we give them less.
Right.
And I suspect that we will need to ultimately tamper somehow, probably via interest rates, inflation. The difficulty is our total government debt as a percentage of GDP.
The U.S. survived the last major inflation crisis thanks to two forces: reduced spending growth under the Reagan administration and Paul Volcker allowing interest rates to climb above inflation. Today, replicating that strategy is far harder. Federal debt now exceeds 120% of GDP, and unfunded entitlements surpass 4 times GDP. To stabilize the system, policymakers may rely on a familiar formula: dollar devaluation, higher inflation, and tax policies that quietly capture more revenue. Eligibility ages for programs like Social Security may shift, and the wealthiest households will likely face increased contributions. These politically painful adjustments are becoming unavoidable.
Is much higher. That is, the ability that we have to survive this without extraordinary measures is much less than it was in 1970, and certainly much less than it was in the good times around 1982. In 1982, on-balance sheet liabilities in the United States government were about 33% of GDP. Now they're about 120.
Yeah, right.
But the real problem are the off-balance sheet liabilities, the $120 trillion in net present value. That number is over 4 times GDP. And that's a truly ugly number. Now, we're going to have to do a lot of things around that, Darcy. We're going to have to twiddle with the formulas. When Social Security was instituted, and this is hugely politically unpopular, when Social Security was instituted, it provided you basically poverty-level subsistence, beginning at age 65, and the average life expectancy of an American male was 66 years.
Good deal.
That's no longer the case, and so we're going to have to fool around with the eligibility age. And despite the fact that Social Security is sold as an insurance program, that's a lie. It's an income transfer. And we're going to have to face that. Old rich guys like me are going to see the cap come off their Social Security contribution, despite the fact that they're going to means test it. In other words, they're going to take the income tax cap off Social Security, drastically raising the taxes on wealthy people, while at the same time denying wealthy people the benefit. This will be hugely unpopular, and it's absolutely positively going to happen.
Geopolitics is reshaping the global monetary landscape. After the U.S. froze hundreds of billions in Russian reserves and weaponized the SWIFT system, many nations began diversifying away from the dollar. Central banks in China, India, Turkey, and across the Middle East have accelerated gold purchases since 2022. At the same time, U.S. Treasury bonds now yield less than the true rate of currency depreciation, offering foreign holders negative real returns. With inflation underreported and geopolitical tensions rising, governments increasingly view gold not just as a store of value, but as a neutral, non-political medium for settling cross-border trade.
Yes, yes, and yes.
Okay.
I think that political moves in the United States, not just Trump's, but political moves in the United States going all the way back to the Obama administration, have necessitated foreign governments saving in gold. The weaponization of the SWIFT banking system by the United States. The SWIFT banking system is not a U.S. possession. Irrespective of what you believe about the efficacy of Russia's actions in the Ukraine, the theft by the U.S. government of $300 billion worth of Russian assets in U.S. Treasuries gives administrations around the world that might not agree with all of U.S. foreign policy pause. The United States, has weaponized the dollar in a way that makes the dollar an unattractive store of wealth for foreign governments. Separately, the US dollar was a wonderful exchange mechanism between countries that didn't trust each other. And they still don't trust each other. The last thing that the Chinese want is $100 billion worth of worthless rubles, or worthless reals, or worthless pesos. The world is beginning to gear up for a period where, at least partially, gold is not merely a store of value, but also a medium of sovereign exchange. And the third thing is, arithmetically, the US Treasury is a lousy deal because it pays, from my point of view, a negative interest rate. And let me explain this. Mm-hmm. Americans, at least, but I think people around the world too, are hoodwinked into believing that the CPI in the US is an accurate measure of the deterioration of the purchasing power of the US dollar, which is hogwash. Since 2020, the basket of goods and services that I personally consume, and I'm an old cheapskate, I don't buy much, suggests to me that the purchasing power of my dollars is deteriorating at about 8% compounded. The CPI is an example. When it's inconvenient, doesn't include food or fuel. I'm a guy who likes to eat. Any index which doesn't include lunch is of no use to me whatsoever. Then the index is subject to hedonic adjustments, which meant that the folks who compile the index tell you what the value of the goods that you've bought are, irrespective of price. And then finally, most laughably, the CPI doesn't include tax, the largest single household expense of Americans. So getting back to your thing about the foreigners, they're asked to buy the US 10-year Treasury yielding 4.5 in a currency where the purchasing power is declining at 8. That means if they lend the US government $1 million for 10 years, the US government promises to give them back $600,000 in purchasing power.